There, on your feet, hands where I can see them.
Evening, officer. Is there a problem?
Please stand up now.
I'd like to show you my ID.
Leave it, on your feet.
Officer, please. What is this about? We're just having dinner.
Ma'am, stay seated.
All right, I'm standing. My hands are right
Step
here.
out of the booth. Don't reach for anything.
It's okay. It's okay.
Officer Darnell Kreese thought he was walking into a routine fraud complaint. A server at the Whitmore Grill, one of the city's most upscale dining establishments, had flagged a table in the private section, reporting that the credit cards being used didn't match the guests. Kreese had been on the force for 9 years, long enough to form habits, long enough to develop patterns, and long enough to let unexamined bias fill in the gaps where evidence should have been. But when he approached the corner booth of the Whitmore Grill that Tuesday evening in late October, what he found wasn't fraud. What he found was Harvey R. David, a man who had spent 22 years building one of the most distinguished civil rights law careers in the state, sitting peacefully at dinner with his family, celebrating the news of his daughter's acceptance into law school. And what unfolded next would cost the city $3.1 million, end 2 careers, trigger a federal investigation, and ignite a community reckoning that no one in that dining room could have predicted. The Whitmore Grill was the kind of restaurant where reservations were made 6 weeks in advance. Mahogany paneling lined the walls. Jazz played softly from a live trio in the corner. White linen tablecloths, crystal stemware, low amber lighting, every detail spoke of refinement and quiet exclusivity. It was the kind of place Harvey had taken clients to for 2 decades. He knew the sommelier by name. The head chef had once catered his firm's annual fundraiser. At the private corner booth sat 4 people. Harvey R. David, 54, senior partner at David & Collinsworth LLP, a civil rights and constitutional law firm he had co-founded after a decade at the Department of Justice. Beside him sat his wife, Renee David, 51, a pediatric cardiologist who had published 3 peer-reviewed papers in the last year alone. Across from them sat their daughter, Imani David, 22, who had just received her acceptance letter from Georgetown University Law Center that very morning. And beside Imani sat her boyfriend, Tariq Osei, 24, a doctoral candidate in urban policy at the State University. The occasion was joy, pure and uncomplicated. Harvey had ordered a bottle of Chateau Margaux to mark the moment. Renee had been crying happy tears since Imani showed them the letter on her phone. Tariq was laughing at something Harvey had said about law school orientation. Imani was beaming. Her whole future stretched out bright and full of promise before her. It was 7:43 in the evening. The restaurant was full. The music was beautiful. Everything felt like exactly what it was, a family at the peak of a perfect moment. Then Officer Darnell Kreese walked in. Asterisk. Kreese had a record that would later become the spine of the case against him. 11 formal complaints of racial bias in his 9 years on the force. 7 dismissed by Internal Affairs without investigation. 3 resulting in mandatory sensitivity training he'd sat through with barely concealed contempt. 1 that had earned him a written reprimand that was quietly expunged from his file 18 months later. His supervisors had described him in performance reviews as assertive, self-assured, and willing to take initiative. None of them had used the word that the federal investigation would eventually use: reckless. The call had come in from a server named Kyle Bridwell, 23 years old, 8 months on the job. Kyle had been assigned to the private section that night, and had grown visibly uncomfortable when he saw the David family seated in the corner booth. He couldn't articulate why. He told the manager on duty, a man named Gerald Potts, that something felt off about the table. That the credit card the gentleman had handed over, a black metal Centurion card, one of the most exclusive cards issued by American Express, available only by invitation to clients who spent over $450,000 annually, didn't seem right. Gerald Potts, who would later resign from his position and issue a public apology, made the call to the police. He described it as standard procedure. No evidence of fraud. No declined transaction. No mismatched signature. Just a feeling. A feeling shaped entirely by who was sitting at that table. Kreese arrived with his partner, Officer Sheila Vance, a 4-year veteran who had her body camera activated from the moment they stepped out of the patrol vehicle. Standard protocol. The footage would later tell a story that no attorney, including Harvey R. David himself, could have scripted more effectively. The camera caught Kreese's face as he entered the restaurant. The way his eyes moved across the dining room. The moment they landed on the David family. The slight forward shift of his jaw. The decision already made before a single word was spoken. He walked to their table without stopping at the host's stand. Without speaking to the manager. Without gathering any information about what, specifically, had been reported. He walked directly to the corner booth with his hand resting on his belt and his voice set to a volume that carried. Asterisk asterisk asterisk. Sir, I need everyone at this table to step away from their seats immediately. Harvey looked up slowly. He had been mid-sentence. He placed his wine glass down with deliberate calm and looked at the officer directly. Good evening, officer. Can you tell us what this is about? Credit cards flagged for suspicious use. I need to see identification from everyone at this table. Of course, Harvey said, his voice measured, professional. I am happy to show you my identification. My name is Harvey R. David. These are my guests. The card we are using is mine. I can show you the card, my license, and my bar credentials. I didn't ask for your credentials. I asked you to stand up. Renee reached across the table and touched Harvey's arm. Imani had gone very still. Tariq was watching the officer with wide, careful eyes, the eyes of a young man who knew exactly how quickly this could go wrong. Officer, Renee said quietly, our daughter got into law school today. We're celebrating. We've done nothing wrong. Ma'am, I'm not speaking to you right now. You are speaking to my wife. Harvey said, his composure holding, though the edge in his voice had sharpened. And I'm telling you, respectfully, that there has been a mistake. If you'll allow me to show you the card and my ID, we can clear this up in 30 seconds. Stand up. All of you. Hands where I can see them. The restaurant had gone quiet. The jazz trio had stopped. Every table in the private section was watching. 3 diners had their phones out. The sommelier, a man named Edouard Blanc who had worked at the Whitmore for 16 years, stood near the bar with his mouth pressed into a grim, furious line. Harvey stood. He was 6'2", silver at his temples, dressed in a charcoal suit that cost more than some people's monthly rent. He stood with the bearing of a man who had argued before the state Supreme Court 11 times and won 9 of those cases. He stood with dignity, even as every instinct he'd spent a lifetime honing told him exactly what was happening. I want to be very clear, Harvey said loudly enough for the room to hear. I am cooperating fully. I am standing. I am not resisting. My name is Harvey R. David. I am a licensed attorney in this state. I am asking for your badge number and the name of your supervising officer. You'll get that information at the station. Turn around. Am I being arrested? You're being detained for fraud investigation. On what basis? Kreese didn't answer. He reached for his cuffs. Imani made a sound, not a scream, just a small, broken exhale, the sound of a young woman watching the world she thought she understood rearrange itself into something darker and more familiar than she'd wanted to believe. Tariq reached across the table and took her hand. Renee sat perfectly still, her face a mask of controlled devastation. Officer Vance stood 2 steps behind Kreese. She would testify later that she knew, in that moment, that what her partner was doing was wrong. That she'd looked at Harvey David, calm, cooperative, clearly not a fraud suspect in any meaningful sense, and felt the wrongness of it land in her chest like a stone. She would also testify that she said nothing. That she followed. That she told herself it wasn't her call to make. It was the regret she would carry longest. Harvey was cuffed and led toward the entrance of the restaurant. The room watched in silence. A woman at a nearby table, Patricia Sung, a federal judge dining with her husband, was already on her phone, her voice low and precise, calling someone she knew could help. Another diner, a man named Marcus Webb, a documentary filmmaker, had his camera out and was recording everything. He would later say that he started recording the moment he saw Kreese's hand on his belt, before a single word had been exchanged. He said he'd seen that posture before. He knew how these stories ended if no one bore witness. Asterisk. What Kreese didn't know, what he had never bothered to find out, was that the Whitmore Grill had recently installed one of the most comprehensive security camera systems of any restaurant in the city. 14 cameras. Full HD, coverage of every entrance, every section, every table, the parking lot, the private dining room, and the bar. The restaurant's general manager, a woman named Claudette Horn, had been summoned from the back office by a frantic busser the moment Kreese entered. She arrived to witness the tail end of the confrontation. She watched Harvey being led toward the door, his hands behind his back, his posture still somehow dignified, still somehow composed. She did not hesitate. She stepped directly into Kreese's path. "Officer, stop. I'm the general manager of this restaurant. I need you to stop right now." "Ma'am, step aside." "I will not. I have 14 security cameras that have been recording this room since 5 p.m. That man and his family arrived at 6:30. They were seated by our host. They ordered from our menu. The card he used was processed without a single issue on every transaction. I have footage. I have records. And I am telling you right now, you have made a serious mistake." Kreese's jaw tightened. He had that look, the look of a man who knew the walls were closing but whose pride wouldn't let him step back from the ledge. He had assumed guilt. He had acted on that assumption. Backing down now would mean admitting he had put a man in handcuffs based on nothing. His pride couldn't process that. "The footage will be reviewed as part of the investigation. He is not going anywhere," Claudette said, her voice steel. "Not until you tell me what charge you're detaining him on. Specifically. Because if you cannot tell me the specific charge, you have no legal basis to remove him from this building." Across the room, Federal Judge Patricia Sung had risen from her table. She walked toward the scene with the unhurried authority of someone who spent her days commanding courtrooms. "Officer," she said, "I'm a federal judge. I've been watching this interaction since you entered. This man has been cooperative, has offered identification, and has not been given a single articulable reason for his detention. If you remove him from this restaurant without probable cause, you will be committing false arrest. I will be a witness to that." The room had transformed. It was no longer a restaurant. It was a courtroom, and Kreese was losing. He removed the handcuffs. He didn't apologize. He didn't explain. He simply uncuffed Harvey David, turned around, and walked out of the Whitmore Grill, his partner Vance following 3 steps behind, her face unreadable. The restaurant was silent for 3 seconds. Then Edouard Blanc began to applaud. And one by one, every person in that room joined him. Asterisk. Harvey R. David did not go home that night and try to forget what had happened. He went home, sat at his kitchen table with a glass of water and a legal pad, and began to write. He had spent 22 years fighting for other people in exactly these situations. He had taken cases where families had been humiliated, detained, prosecuted, where the machinery of bias had ground through someone's life and left wreckage behind. He had won many of those cases. He had lost some. He had always believed in the process, even when the process failed. Now he was on the other side of it. And he intended to use every tool at his disposal. Within 72 hours, Harvey's firm had filed a federal civil rights complaint against Officer Kreese, Officer Vance, the city police department, and the city itself, alleging false arrest, unlawful detention, racial profiling, and violations under 42 U.S.C. Section 1983. The complaint named the restaurant manager Gerald Potts as a contributing party and cited the server Kyle Bridwell's report as the racially biased catalyst. The evidence was overwhelming. The 14 security cameras had captured everything. Claudette Horn had made 5 copies of the footage within the hour and distributed them to secure locations. Marcus Webb's footage had been uploaded to multiple cloud servers before Kreese's patrol car had left the parking lot. Judge Patricia Sung's witness statement was filed before the week was out. The sommelier Edouard Blanc gave a 12-page deposition. 31 other diners submitted statements. Not one contradicted the David family's account. Kreese's personnel file was subpoenaed. The 11 complaints of racial bias were entered into the record. Internal affairs documents showing the dismissal of those complaints without meaningful investigation were obtained through discovery. A pattern emerged, not of an officer who had made isolated mistakes, but of a department that had systematically protected a documented pattern of bias. Vance cooperated with investigators. She described, in detail, the moment she knew Kreese was wrong and chose silence over intervention. Her testimony was among the most damning in the case, not because she had acted with malice, but because her complicity demonstrated how institutional cultures normalize injustice. She pleaded for leniency and received a lighter penalty for her cooperation, but she would tell investigators that the leniency felt unearned. "I should have stopped him," she said. "I knew better and I said nothing. There's no version of that where I come out clean." The city's legal team reviewed the evidence package and immediately began settlement discussions. Their first offer was $750,000. Harvey's co-counsel, a litigator named Daria Okonkwo who specialized in civil rights damages, rejected it before the email had finished loading. "This isn't a negotiation about money," Daria told the city's council. "This is a negotiation about whether your city is willing to be accountable for what it enabled. Come back when you're serious." The city came back with $1.8 million. Daria rejected that too. They went to a second mediation session. Harvey sat across the table from the city's representatives and spoke for 20 minutes without notes. He described his daughter's face when the handcuffs came out. He described his wife's hands, the hands of a cardiologist who had saved hundreds of lives, pressed flat on the table trying not to shake. He described Tariq reaching across to hold Imani's hand. He described the specific, particular silence of a room full of people watching a man be treated as guilty for the crime of existing in a space while black. He described what it meant to spend your life fighting for justice, and then become its victim in the middle of your daughter's celebration dinner. The city settled for $3.1 million, plus a mandated package of departmental reforms that included independent civilian oversight of all racial profiling complaints, mandatory body camera review protocols, the creation of a public-facing database tracking stop and detention demographics by officer and district, and mandatory implicit bias training developed and administered by external experts, not checkbox sessions, but substantive, ongoing engagement. *****. Officer Darnell Kreese was terminated. The department's internal investigation, prompted by the federal complaint, reviewed his entire 9-year career. What they found was what the complaints had always suggested, a pattern of pedestrian stops, traffic detentions, and searches that disproportionately targeted black residents at rates 4 times higher than white residents in identical circumstances. Reports written with coded language. Arrests for minor infractions that dissolved when the detainees could afford legal representation. Charges that stuck against people who couldn't. 14 cases were reopened. 6 people had their records expunged when Kreese's reports were found to be unreliable and biased. 2 convictions were overturned when newly reviewed body cam footage that had been filed but never examined, showed the detainees had been compliant and Kreese had escalated without cause. Kreese was charged with deprivation of civil rights under color of law. He pled no contest to avoid trial, receiving 3 years of probation, 500 hours of community service, and a lifetime ban from law enforcement. In the months that followed, Kreese gave no interviews and made no public statements. Those who knew him said he maintained, privately, that he had done nothing wrong. That it had been a misunderstanding. That he'd been following procedure. He never said the words that would have mattered. He never said, "I assumed he was guilty because of how he looked. I was wrong. I harmed innocent people." The police chief who had overseen Kreese's career, signing off on the dismissal of complaint after complaint, retired under pressure 6 months after the settlement. The union that had shielded Kreese through years of misconduct faced internal revolt from officers who were exhausted by the association with bad actors who made their work harder, more dangerous, and more morally compromised. Gerald Potts, the restaurant manager who had made the call, resigned within days of the story breaking publicly. He issued a written apology that he described as inadequate, because he could not find words proportionate to what he had set in motion. He entered a period of what he called very necessary reckoning with himself. Whether that reckoning led anywhere meaningful, only he could say. Kyle Bridwell, the server whose discomfort had started the chain of events, was 23 years old. He gave a deposition in which he said he didn't know why he'd been uncomfortable. That he couldn't explain it. That he wished he could. He was not named in the lawsuit. He was not charged with anything. But he would later write, in a public essay that surprised many people with its honesty, that not being charged didn't mean not being responsible. That bias dressed up as instinct was still bias. That he had looked at a successful black man using a luxury credit card in a fine dining restaurant, and his brain had told him something was wrong, and he had listened to his brain instead of demanding evidence from it. ******. The settlement was announced on a Thursday. By Friday, every major news outlet in the state had covered it. By the following Monday, it had gone national. The footage from Marcus Webb's camera, Harvey David standing in that restaurant, handcuffed, composed, dignified, his family behind him, circulated millions of times across every platform. It became, in the language of that moment, iconic. Not because it was unusual, but because it was documented. What the coverage could not fully capture was what happened inside the David household in the weeks and months that followed. Harvey went back to work immediately. His colleagues described him as focused, even energized, channeling what had happened into fuel for the cases already on his desk. But Renee noticed the changes. The way he checked the locks twice at night now. The way he paused, briefly, every time a police car passed on the street. The way he sometimes went very quiet in the middle of a conversation and she knew, without asking, where his mind had gone. Imani deferred her law school enrollment by a semester. She said she needed time to process what had happened. Her therapist said what had been activated wasn't just the memory of one night but a deeper reckoning with what her life would actually require of her, the specific tax that being a black woman in America would levy against her, no matter how accomplished, no matter how prepared. She returned to Georgetown the following January. She was excellent there. She would graduate at the top of her class. She never stopped thinking about that dinner. Tariq finished his doctoral dissertation. Its central argument, about how urban space is racially coded and how that coding shapes policing, commerce, and community, was informed, in ways both visible and invisible, by sitting at that corner booth and watching the man across from him be handcuffed for eating dinner while black. He defended successfully. He dedicated the dissertation to Harvey and Renee David, and to everyone who had never had a federal judge at the next table. Renee went back to her patients, her research, her impossible hours. But she started doing something she hadn't done before. She started talking about that night. At conferences. At hospital grand rounds. At conversations about the mental health of black professionals navigating institutions that were not built with them in mind. She talked about what it felt like to be a cardiologist who had performed open-heart surgery and still not been safe at a dinner table. She talked about how the two things were not separate. That the systems that produced one produced the other. She was always the most composed person in the room when she told the story. And somehow, that made it land harder. The Whitmore Grill changed ownership within 3 months of the incident. The new owner, a restaurateur named Sylvia Marchetti, reached out to the David family before the doors reopened. She asked if they would meet with her. Harvey accepted. Sylvia had redesigned the training program from the ground up. Every server, host, manager, and bartender underwent implicit bias training before their first shift. The restaurant adopted a formal non-discrimination policy with real enforcement mechanisms, not a laminated poster in the break room but a living protocol with clear reporting structures and consequences. She hired Claudette Horn as a consulting partner in the redesign. She asked the David family if they would return. Gloria said she needed time. It took 4 months. But they came back. They sat at the corner booth. Harvey ordered the Chateau Margaux again, the same bottle from that October night, left unfinished. Rene held his hand under the table. Imani and Tariq sat across from them. The jazz trio played in the corner. The light was amber and warm. When they used the card to pay, the same black metal Centurion card, the server processed it without a word, without a glance, without a flicker of hesitation. Sylvia came to their table as they were leaving. She didn't say much. She said she was grateful they had come back. That she knew it had cost them something to walk through that door again. That she intended to honor that cost every day this restaurant was open. Then do it, Harvey said simply. That's all anyone's asking. Just do better. Every day, just do better. They walked out into the night together, the four of them, and for a moment they stood on the sidewalk and breathed the cool air and said nothing. There was nothing that needed to be said. They had fought. They had won. They had come back. The night was ordinary and beautiful and entirely theirs. The David and Collinsworth Foundation, established in part with the settlement proceeds, became one of the most active civil rights legal defense funds in the state within its first year of operation. It funded legal representation for families who had experienced racial profiling and police misconduct but lacked the resources to fight back. It established a scholarship program for law students of color committed to civil rights practice. It published research on the demographics of police stops and detentions, turning raw data into the kind of public accountability that was hard to ignore and harder to dismiss. Harvey spoke at law schools, at congressional hearings, at police reform conferences, at community forums in church basements and high school gymnasiums. He always told the story plainly. What happened? What it felt like. What he did about it. What anyone could do about it. He talked about knowing your rights. Recording everything. Not resisting physically but resisting legally, loudly, clearly, in front of witnesses. He talked about the importance of the people around you, the judge at the next table, the sommelier who started applauding, the documentary filmmaker who already had his camera out. He talked about how witness isn't passive. How showing up is an act. How the decision to record, to speak, to stand up and say this is wrong is a decision with real consequences for people in real danger. He talked about his daughter. How she was going to be a lawyer. How she had watched her father be handcuffed in a restaurant on the night she got into law school. How he hoped that what she had seen, both the injustice and the fight, had prepared her for the work ahead. He talked about Tariq's dedication. He said he hoped the dissertation changed something. He believed it would. He talked about Renee. He said she was the bravest person he'd ever known, and that he'd been saying that for 30 years, and that the night at the Whitmore hadn't changed that assessment, it had confirmed it. Years later, in a lecture to a room full of first-year law students, Harvey R. David would be asked what the experience had taught him that he hadn't known before. He thought about it for a long time. The room waited. I knew the law, he said finally. I'd been practicing civil rights law for over 2 decades. I knew every statute, every precedent, every procedural mechanism for fighting this kind of injustice. I had fought it for other people my entire career. He paused. What I learned, he said, is that knowing the law doesn't protect you from the moment. It doesn't stop the handcuffs from going on. It doesn't stop your daughter from making that sound. It doesn't stop your wife's hands from shaking. The law is what you reach for after the moment. During the moment, you're just a person. A person trying to stay composed and keep your family safe and not give anyone a reason to make it worse. He looked out at the room. That's why the work matters. Not just the winning. The work. Every case, every complaint, every piece of legislation, every training program, every camera, every witness who speaks up, all of it is trying to close the gap between the law as written and the law as experienced. Between what the Constitution says and what actually happens at a corner booth on a Tuesday night when someone decides you don't belong. He gathered his notes. Close the gap, he said. That's the whole job. Just keep closing the gap. The room was quiet for a moment. Then someone started to applaud. And one by one, just as they had in the Whitmore Grill on that October night, everyone joined in. If you believe accountability must follow injustice, That evidence must outweigh assumption. Subscribe and share this story. Tomorrow, we bring another truth that refuses to be silenced.